This is FRM Part 1, Book 1, Foundations of Risk Management. Today we'll be talking about Chapter 4, What is ERM? Sometimes referred to as enterprise-wide risk management, and the definition is exactly what the name suggests. Think of risk management from an entire global perspective. Let's see what those learning outcomes sound like in this chapter. Describe enterprise risk management, compare and contrast differing definitions, compare benefits and costs. Describe the roles and responsibilities of the CRO, and then describe key components of an ERM program. Just 4 of them in this chapter. Let's go ahead and get started. Start with a definition of ERM. A holistic plan-based risk management strategy. Remember that word holistic means. It's an adjective that means something like we're characterizing a plan-based strategy in terms of looking at the business from an entire perspective rather than just looking at it as separate and different and unique and independent business units. So this is a strategy where the firm identifies and addresses methodically, and that's important, potential risks to achieving the strategic objectives. And what's important about this is that we need to make certain that we're aware of the interrelationships, the interdependence, and the dependence between and among the various kinds of risks. This, of course, is way different from silo-based risk, where each management, each segment, each business unit is managed separately from a risk perspective. So let's go ahead and ask the question, well, what's wrong with silo risk management? And to understand this, you got to go back to some things that you learned about in your investments class, or maybe some investments textbooks, or maybe just kind of general investment strategies that you know from your own personal investment. There is no doubt that if any one of us hits the Powerball lottery for $400 or $500 million this week, the first thing we're going to do is pay taxes and then buy houses and cars for all of our families and friends. But we're still going to have hundreds of millions of dollars left over to invest. We're not going to pick one company. We're not going to invest just in a company, even though it could be a great company, because the risk is too high. What we know is that diversification allows for the reduction of risk, and that's because of this thing called the correlation coefficient between and among individual funds or individual stocks that make up a portfolio. Well, of course, this holds true as well. The risks between and among different silos are dynamic and correlated with each other. So you cannot possibly do this mathematically or from a theoretical perspective, evaluate risks independently of how they affect the rest of the business. Suboptimal performance is going to result from this fragmented approach. And then if you do this, the metrics are going to be faulty and misleading and unhelpful and incomplete. Here's a good picture. So think of the silo risk management strategy over on the left-hand side, where each individual type of risk has its own umbrella. So you manage that risk with this particular umbrella, and you're not really worried about how the other risks are being managed. On the other hand, ERM has one giant umbrella that's overseeing and managing each of those risks. Now, I say this in every one of these videos. Look at the umbrella there on the right-hand side. Note that it's got to be much more efficient to identify the risks and quantify the risks and manage the risks using the ERM model. How about an alternative definition? This is one of those learning objectives. The Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission. This was headed by this guy, James Treadway. And this commission is a group of 5 or so regulatory accounting bodies that were formed back in the mid-1980s. I believe it was 1985. And the vision, if you go to its webpage, the vision sounds something like that COSO wants to be the leading thought processor of transparency and risk control and risk management in helping businesses seek out the optimal ERM strategy. And so here's another quote from their webpage. ERM is a process affected by an entity's board of directors, management, and other personnel. So in the previous chapter, we focused on board of directors. We'll talk a little bit about the board in this chapter as well. Applied in strategy setting and across the enterprise, so designed to identify potential events. So there's the identify the risks that may affect the entity, and then manage the risks within that and provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of the entity objectives. So you get the sense that this might be an alternative definition that's put forth by a group of accountants who think about this stuff all the time. But the commonality between and among all of these definitions is, kind of this umbrella. All right, ERM is responsible for organizing and coordinating an integrated risk management framework. And so I did this in a previous video. So think of these silos here. Silos, they're separate. I grew up in Pennsylvania farmland, and so we had those corn bins, and you could see the corn was here and maybe the wheat was here. And I don't really know where I'm going with this, but clearly they had their own unit, and when the farmer wanted the corn, he went here, and when the farmer wanted the wheat, he went here. But clearly that's not going to work. It needs to be an integrated risk management framework. So ERM, within that integrated risk management framework, establishes policies for managing risk across the business units and provides an opportunity for senior managers to exercise control and monitoring of that exposure. What this does is it gives those responsible for decision making a clear picture of the firm's total risk exposure. And of course, the upper level executives should have information about the indicators of risk. All right, so what was that? That was the identify the risk and maybe part of quantifying the risks. It's an effective, ERM is effective in providing the management with a wide picture of risks. All right, how about some benefits here? Provides the board of directors and the chief executive officer with the bird's eye view. Diversifies risks within an organization across business units. All right, so this approach avoids the tendency of the silo approach to risk management. I said that before, and here's one of the implications is that if you're doing the silo, and so let's go back to my farm example. You got the corn and you have the wheat. Well, how do we handle the, let's say, commodity price risk? The farmer's probably going to use some kind of forward contract or a futures contract to manage those risks. But if the farmer is doing this in a silo-based strategy, then there's no way it's going to be nearly as efficient as if the farmer goes to, let's say, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and says, look, I have corn and I have wheat. How can you help me arrange a futures position to hedge that risk? All right, so what ERM helps managers to avoid is using separate and inefficient hedging tools. And so in addition, the ERM improves the functioning of the business unit and not only influences business decisions, but moves those business decisions towards a more optimal level. Remember the goal of the business, maximize shareholder wealth. I'm going to talk about that in just a few seconds. Now, thinking of this in the context of portfolio management, it changes the outlook of risk management. And so this is really important from a defensive approach. I like to give sports analogies. And so, think about the end of a football game when the defense, they say, oh, we just want to hang back and make sure they don't throw a touchdown pass. And the offense can then, go on the attack. And how many times do you see the offense go down and kick a field or score a touchdown at the end of the game? So defensive approaches, a lot of times they're not good, but it can be a strategic offensive tool so that you stay ahead of it. And of course, ultimately, this lends for more profitable outcomes for the business and the organization. What about organizational efficiency? And so what this does, together with the ERM approach and the CRO, it allows the firm to integrate the risk management activities across the business unit. Now, let's go back to the goal of the business. We know that's the goal of the business from our corporate finance days: maximize shareholder wealth. How do we do that? By investing in projects that have lots of cash flows, and by investing in projects that have low weighted average cost of capital. We try to eliminate and reduce the agency conflict. But in the context of ERM, I want you to think about it in the following way. I want you to think about the goal of wealth protection and value protection. I want you to think about the goal of providing an environment in which the firm can achieve desired profitability and cash flow levels. So that ERM, those are two internal goals. And then some external goals like, being in compliance with rules and regulations and laws, and also for providing stability for all of the stakeholders in the business. All right, so think about the difference between those two kinds of goals. Of course, the goal is to maximize shareholder wealth. On the corporate finance side, we do that by, managing the cash flows. But on the ERM side, we've got those two internal ways, so value protection and generating lots and lots of profitability that is sustainable over time. So make sure you're aware of the compliance function, the business lines, the audit function, the finance function. So combine those two kinds of definitions that I gave you for the goal of the business, and that enables the business to function in a cohesive manner. All right, in the silo approach, each business has its own measure of risk. These reports may not represent the overall organizational risk. So remember, it's the board of the directors that establishes the strategy for the business. Now, part of that must mean is that when we're pursuing this strategy, there are risks involved. So, of course, the board needs to be aware of all of these risks. The board establishes the risk appetite of the organization. Now, this ERM function is going to provide the board with all of the details that it needs to move away from the tendency to want to look at things from the silo approach to look at things from the portfolio management approach. All right, how about the chief risk officer? Now, this man or woman is going to report directly to the board of directors about the overall risk exposure. So the CRO is the leader of the ERM function. There's no doubt about that. Supervises the organization's risk management framework and reports on overall business risk and key exposures to the board of directors. Responsible for resource and capital allocation. So think about the skill set that this risk officer needs. Not to mention the technical skill set of being able to evaluate things like value at risk or standard deviation or normal distributions or distributions that are not normal, to be able to compose and craft confidence intervals, but also has to have experience on the right-hand side of the balance sheet, capital allocation. Businesses are always borrowing money, how to efficiently manage the right-hand side of the balance sheet. Now, of course, the CRO is going to be directly reporting to the board of directors, and so should have complete access to the board of directors whenever something comes up, because let's face it, that risk management has been around for a long, long time, right? Since the very beginning of time. And risks back in the way old days mostly centered around natural events, like a flood or a hurricane. And so it was very difficult to manage those things because, we still can't manage those things. But as time evolved and the right-hand side and the left-hand side of the balance sheets became more complex, then Wall Street and the financial services industry came up with some really, really cool ideas about how to use financial engineering to manage risks that could be quantified. And by the way, there are futures contracts that are weather related. Those are cool things in and among themselves. Maybe that's a conversation for another day. let's look at that last bullet point there. Help the function of the CEO to improve business profits. So that's what I was talking about earlier about the combination of those goals. All right, so what does the Chief Risk Officer need? Here's a summary of what I was talking about on that previous page. All right, leadership, of course, the ability to lead and to convince those who he or she supervises that their job is critical to the success of the business. Technical skills, that's what I was talking about just a minute ago, but also reporting and consulting skills, the ability to persuade, and then being able to manage all those different groups of stakeholders, like shareholders, of course, like employees, of course, but think of stakeholders. This is how I always tell my students, think of stakeholders or all those people on both sides of the supply chain. What's the goal of the business? Maximize shareholder wealth. Notice that last sentence there, improve the value of the firm's asset. And so what I want you to remember is that we're trying to improve the market value of the firm's asset. How do we do that? Remember, when we calculate the net present value of any of the firm's assets or any of the firm's product lines, we compute the present value of all of those expected cash flows discounted at a risk-adjusted interest rate. And so the chief risk officer has to have skills, like this. I always do this to my students. Broad, there's the broad base, but also has to go a little deep as well. All right, how about components of the enterprise risk management? We start with corporate governance, which of course begins with the board of directors, and then top down, it flows down to the corporate executive team, and then that flows down to the line managers. Remember, a line manager is anybody who's in a supervisor capacity. That's kind of a general idea. And then portfolio management, that is the avoidance of the silo thought process. Think and act like a fund manager. And then here's the part here that I like best. There's a transfer of risk opportunities where we can use derivative securities or insurance contracts or some other form to avoid taking risks that are too concentrated for the business, or they're inefficient and it really doesn't make any sense for us to accept those kinds of risks. So we kind of transfer those out. Another one I like are the risk analytics. These analytical tools, from simple things like standard deviation to more complex models like a Monte Carlo simulation. Of course, data and technology resources are critical. We've got to have inputs to all of these models so that we can put something out that makes sense. And then I mentioned the stakeholders management just a few minutes ago, and that's an important concept to think of. All of the stakeholders. I mean, what's the goal of the business? Maximize shareholder wealth, but you can't ignore the other stakeholders inside the business and those that hit the business from its periphery. So those are good 7 components of enterprise risk management to know. All right, corporate governance. So this is an appropriate organizational process or policy or directive that's related to the measurement and the management of the risks. And of course, this is determined by the board of directors and the senior executives. Regulatory requirements and penalties associated with non-compliance. This goes back to what I was telling you. That was that first external goal of the business, to be in compliance with all the laws and regulations, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we've talked about the board of directors and its responsibilities in the previous chapter, but here's another good summary of this. Define risk appetite of the firm, ensure proper risk management personnel. I always tell my students that the overriding job of the board of directors, beyond the establishment of the strategy of the business, is to hire and fire the executive team. And so ensure that proper risk management personnel and practices are in place. That goes in line with that. Framework for enterprise risk management, allocation of roles and responsibilities, devise measures and methodologies. Now remember, the board is probably not going to be an expert in all of the different types of risks and all of the different ways to measure those types of risks. I mean, of course, I would guess that most board members would know about beta as a measure of systematic risk. But I'm guessing that not all board members would know how to compute beta, would know how beta is unstable over time, or that there are different ways to compute beta, even though it has a pretty basic formula, and how you can apply beta to change things like systematic risk or other kinds of risk by using futures contracts or some other derivative. It's also the board of directors' responsibility to create benchmarks. And so this is really important. We've got, so let's think about this. We have this much expectation for profitability and this much expectation for risk. And so if after a year's time period, we come up with this much profitability and we took this much risk, well, then the business needs to ask itself the question, okay, what did somebody do over there? Or could we have done it better? So the establishment of these benchmarks are really, really important to be able to look at the external landscape and say, boy, that firm over there, they're pretty similar to us and they did way worse than we did. Let's figure out why we're better than they are so that we can continue to improve. And then the last thing here on this slide is to ensure that there is a risk-adjusted return-based compensation for all of the individuals inside of this function. Now here are the line managers. Of course, these are anybody who has responsibility in a supervisor capacity. So each line manager has to consider that corporate risk policy while making business decisions. One of the cool things about being aware and being able to identify and quantify all of these risks is that it's possible to price those risks into the products and the services. Let me give you just a quick example. Let's suppose that we're a company that manufactures and sells school buses. And we also have another business segment in which we lease and operate and transport school students in the various districts. So we have this one operating unit over here, and then we have a service over here. Well, just think about the issue of security. The operating segment can establish its risk appetite inside of there and maybe take some measures to lower the risk appetite by doing something in the construction of those school buses. Over here, the bus drivers are concerned about things like safety and things like the behavior of bus drivers and the behavior of the children on the bus. And so if we manage this separately, we might say something like, hey, let's buy an insurance contract in case one of our bus drivers does something wrong. Transfer that risk out. But if we do this from an enterprise risk management strategy, maybe back here, the board of directors could say, hey, you know what? Why don't we install video cameras and audio recorders and GPSs on the bus? And what that does is that mitigates the risk over here of actually having to monitor the behavior of the bus drivers. All right, so what we can do from that enterprise-wide risk management process is price those risk management ideas like the video recorders into the product and the service. Of course, we need to audit and review. We need to perform our due diligence. I mean, that's that. I remember that word when I was an undergraduate accounting major. Due diligence. I heard it all the time, and it finally dawned on me. It just means let's work really hard. Let's work hard. Let's work efficiently, and let's have an outcome assessment. Yeah, the risk management function should not assess and handle risks of business units individually. This is the portfolio management idea that we've been talking about. So we can have internal diversification for optimizing overall company returns. And the integration of this risk management function is going to help create natural hedges. So you see how that natural hedge with my school bus example occurs. So maybe we don't need the insurance contract over here by providing services to school districts because we have installed the cameras during the operations process. So here's a really good concluding statement. The ERM function associates shareholder value creation process with risk management. Now, of course, part of the risk management idea is to accept some risks, but to transfer them out. And so there are going to be certain and specific risks that we don't really want to have any part of. So I have written down there undesirable for the firm, and we're going to use things like derivative securities, maybe an option contract or a futures contract or a swap contract or maybe some kind of an insurance contract to transfer that risk. A lot of times this is the most cost-effective solution. A forward contract and a futures contract is almost free. I mean, they cost so little. Now, an option contract can be kind of salty. And insurance contracts, depending on what they are, they can be expensive as well. But this integrated risk management strategy helps ensure that if there are natural hedging strategies possible, that the smart men and women inside of this ERM function are going to be able to identify those natural hedging opportunities, which would, of course, not be possible inside of that silo structure. Now, of course, the obvious natural hedging strategy, and I mentioned this in a previous video, is by managing currency risks when operating in various countries by just trying to match payables and receivables inside of a firm with each currency. Then you don't need a forward contract on a currency. Firms should structure business policies to reduce the accumulation of high amounts of risk. So what we don't want is if I'm back to my school bus example, we don't want huge amounts of risks associated with transporting students. I mean, that's a risky enough proposition as well, right? I mean, everyone is in favor of ensuring the safety of children being transported from their homes to schools and then back again. You can't do this without some kind of a metric. And so advanced technology and risk management techniques are going to be used to calculate not only compute and quantify the risks, but be able to calculate and compute, and sometimes has to be estimated, the cost of risk reduction. Risk management strategies based on comparative advantages. So everything that you learned back in your microeconomics days applies here. I do this to my children all the time. You've seen this in a previous video. When my children want to ask me, Dad, should I do something like practice basketball or go to the movies? I say marginal costs and marginal benefits. And the cool thing about trying to be a good parent is that when I give them that decision, it's pretty much an immediate decision. They can say, okay, yeah, I'd rather do this or I'd rather do that. But for risk management, notice that those marginal costs, they could be in present value terms, but they could also be the reduction of future liabilities. So we can take present values for both marginal costs and marginal benefits. So don't you love this last bullet point? I'm going to read these. Ready? Risk-adjusted returns, risk-adjusted net present values. So when we're in the corporate finance function and we compute net present value, when we compute a risk-adjusted net present value and we say therefore accept, we can do so in the comfort of knowing that we have done all of our homework, all of the due diligence, and say reasonably, you know what, we've thought about all of the possibilities and we want to invest in this particular project. Now, you have all of these different kinds of businesses and markets outside. So you have some internal stuff and you have some external stuff, and there's data from all of these different sources. And so you need to collect it, you need to aggregate it so that we can make a fair assessment of both business line and risk management functions. What we need to make sure is that there's a high quality of the data fed into the risk management systems. And so think about this as just a loop. We collect the data and we try to make sure that it's accurate, like a good journalist does, identify the source and then maybe find another source that those two sources agree with each other. So that then we know that that's probably of high quality. So we're going to invest in these technological assets and good quality software. And there are lots of experts out there that we can consult that are going to give us some good ideas on what is the best software. Stakeholder management. So what did I say to you earlier? Think about everything that goes on both ends of the supply chain. When I was a graduate student, later in my class schedule, we learned about stakeholder management and how important these other stakeholders were. In the beginnings of a PhD program, we're always taught maximize shareholder wealth, shareholder, that's all we care about. But there are other peoples out there that are extremely important. So we need to satisfy those stakeholders to support the notion of maximizing shareholder wealth. Transparency is important. Periodic reports about risk exposures to all of the different stakeholders, including the employees. And then it's important to communicate these risk management methods to everybody out there who's willing to listen. Notice that governments down there are on the bottom right. Maybe they should be in the top middle. All right, how do we do? There's our learning objectives recap. We just had 4 of them, and I think we covered all of those pretty well. Thanks for watching. Next up, we'll talk about some financial services institutions issues.